This video is sponsored by Stuff for Hire. Ever since the release of the Snyder Cut, the subset of the total DC film fan base has been clamoring for a restoration of the Snyderverse. This sentiment was not shared by the previous regime of DC films, who were all about ending it once and for all, and originally planned to use the Flash as a means to that end. But that previous regime is now gone, and what they wanted is moot. It's what the new Zaslav regime wants that decides the future of DC on film. The question then is if the new regime wants to restore the Snyderverse, or if they want to move in a different direction. And if so, which one? We have some information on where they are leaning, and we'll go through that in this video. But in order to do so, we must begin by establishing what restoring the Snyderverse actually entails. With that clarified, we can then look into what obstacles stand in the way, and finally, what Zaslav seemingly intends to do. The term Snyderverse means different things to different people. Case in point, the semantic argument could be made that since most of Snyder's cast are still in play, the Snyderverse is still ongoing, and therefore doesn't have to be restored, though this is an argument that most Snyder fans might not agree with. For the purposes of this video then, we will define restoring the Snyderverse as movies that don't have to be directed by Snyder himself, but which do feature Snyder's cast, and most importantly, continue the storylines Snyder left open-ended. These include the return of Darkseid, Superman taking a turn towards injustice, the Mad Max Batman teaming up with his frenemies, and lest we forget, the death of Robin. This definition would certainly be consistent with what our sources claim Warner themselves consider to be the Snyderverse, namely the trilogy of Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Zack Snyder's Justice League. So with the Snyderverse and what it means to restore it established, what obstacles are standing in the way of that happening? We're about to find out. But before we do, there are other kinds of obstacles that may hit much closer to home. Say you need a ladder for a one-time job on your roof, but now is not the right time to shell out for a brand new one, especially since you only need it once. Or say you need a camera to film a couple of special events a year, or you need a new stroller for your baby, but only for a couple of months before that's outgrown and you'll need a new one anyway. In these and so many other cases, shelling out full price for a brand new item at the store not only feels like throwing money out the window, it's a waste of resources, as so many others will have done and felt exactly like you before. Well, that's where this video sponsor, Stuff for Hire, has you covered. Stuff for Hire enables you to borrow the things you need from your local community by connecting local lenders and borrowers. If you need to borrow something, whether it be for a day or a longer period of time, you can browse by category or search directly, or if you have any as new or lightly used items you'd rather monetize and see put to good use rather than have it collect dust, you can join up as a lister and relax knowing that all items are covered by insurance. Stuff for Hire's mission is saving the world by connecting local communities and reducing waste. This is something we at Midnight's Edge wholeheartedly support, so check them out at stuffforhire.com. The link is in the description. And with that, let's get back to the obstacles standing in the way of restoring the Snyderverse. While the Zaslav regime ultimately decides the future of DC on film, their decision will be informed by the decisions of the previous regimes. Let's examine how. In a sense, the Snyderverse ended when the second weekend box office numbers for Batman v Superman were in, because that's when the then Warner management decided to creatively move in a different direction. To this end, Snyder himself was demoted and soon replaced by Geoff Johns and Peter Berg as the functional heads of DC on film. Their mandate was to move away from what Snyder had established and move in a more colorful direction, which they did with Aquaman and Shazam. Johns and Berg didn't last long enough to see those movies released though, as they were blamed for the failure of Joss Whedon's retooled Justice League and replaced by Walter Hamada. The Hamada regime continued the direction set forth under Johns and Berg, moving ever further away from the Snyderverse. When Ann Sarnoff became head of Warner Media, her instruction to Hamada was to move DC not just in a more colorful direction, but in a more activist one as well. While all this was happening in the studio, in the background, the #ReleaseTheSnyderCut movement was gaining traction. However, neither it nor its proponents were appreciated in the slightest within Warner. As we covered extensively at the time, the decision to finish up and release Zack Snyder's Justice League did not come from Warner. Instead, it was forced on them by corporate owner AT&T, which saw it as a means of promoting what was to be their flagship streaming service, HBO Max. Warner only saw the Snyder Cut as a one-and-done deal though, and they wanted to make sure everyone knew that. So on the eve of its release, Ann Sarnoff took to the trades to express her disappointment with the whole Snyder Cut movement, who reportedly had bullied and harassed Warner executives in order to get their way. Then she closed the book on it, saying, "I appreciate that they love Zack's work, and we're very thankful for his many contributions to DC. We're just so happy that he could bring his cut of the Justice League to life because that wasn't in the plan until a year ago. With that comes the completion of his trilogy. We're very happy we've done this, but we're very excited about the plans we have for all the multi-dimensional DC characters that are being developed right now." This was their way of saying, get over the Snyderverse and get excited for our plans instead. We now know their plans included ending the Snyderverse once and for all by killing off Affleck's Batman and Cavill's Superman in The Flash and replacing them with the safer and more diverse Batgirl and Supergirl going forward. Alas, even without knowing what Sarnoff's plans were, the Snyder fans didn't get excited for them. Instead, they started demanding both the Ayer cut of Suicide Squad and a full restoration of the Snyderverse. But this was seen as ingratitude by the industry, which didn't like the optics of seemingly giving into fan pressure in the first place, and it caused great annoyance among quite a few people within Warner who never wanted to release the Snyder Cut in the first place. Case in point, in an August 29th article, Variety describes the sentiments many hold, particularly among the holdovers from the Sarnoff administration, writing, "Privately, studio insiders have lamented that Zack Snyder's Justice League never should have happened. Rather than quiet the unceasing online campaigning to #release the Snyder Cut, the 4-hour HBO Max feature only further entrenched the vocal and extremely online Snyderverse fanbase in opposition to the leadership at the studio in general and at DC in particular." But regardless of how much Warner may regret that it was, the Snyder Cut was indeed released, and it has been collecting data and viewership numbers ever since. If those numbers had been through the roof, that would have forced Warner to revise their position on restoring the Snyderverse. As it turned out, however, those numbers proved to be another obstacle. The Snyder Cut is estimated to have earned little more than $15 million in video sales so far, and despite a strong star on HBO Max with a reported 2.2 million viewers in the early days, we have no way of knowing how many have seen it there by now. What we have learned from one of Tom's sources, though, is that 60% of those who started watching it didn't finish it, which is supported by reports in Forbes and other outlets. Contrast that to how House of the Dragon opened to 8 million views on streaming and another 2 on regular HBO, you can see how disappointing the Snyder Cut numbers were perceived as being. But even without the Game of Thrones comparison, the numbers weren't good enough to force the Sarnoff regime into revising their future plans for DC. Although Sarnoff's plans were eventually squashed by the new David Zaslav administration, and in a very public way. By that time, however, the previous administration had cultivated another data point which proves a further obstacle to restoring the Snyderverse. Matt Reeves' The Batman kick-started what is functionally a competing DC film universe, and that wasn't exclusively down to the director's ego. According to our own Tom Connor's sources, the intention was that if The Batman had been sufficiently successful, like grossing more than $1 billion, that would have heralded a gradual shift in operational priorities and resources away from the interconnected continuity derived from the Snyder films, and towards something more isolated but focused, as seen in The Batman. Furthermore, if The Batman had been a smash hit, that would immediately have closed the book on any chance of ever restoring any Snyderverse. If The Batman had bombed, however, that would have scored a point in favor of restoring the Snyderverse, as the audience would have voted against a full-on reset with their dollars. As it turned out, The Batman was neither a runaway hit nor an outright bomb, but something in the middle. From Warner's point of view, that's actually a worst-case scenario, because in deciding what to do next, it leaves them with an ambiguous data point that's open to interpretation. According to our Tom Connor's sources, Warner's chosen interpretation was that the audience will accept a different direction for DC on film, meaning Warner doesn't have to be beholden to the Snyderverse, but the audience didn't fully embrace the vision presented in The Batman either. Even so, that Zaslav is even considering a part 2 to The Batman, and that the Penguin spin-off series remains in development are bad news for anyone hoping for a Snyderverse restoration. A Zaslav regime clearly has a very different plan for DC on film going forward than what the previous Sarnoff regime did, but this doesn't mean that the Snyderverse will be restored. On the contrary, the relatively disappointing figures for the Snyder Cut on HBO Max and the modest success of the Batman are data points that can't be ignored, and which does not leave restoring the Snyderverse looking like a worthwhile financial proposition. And remember, David Zaslav is all about monetizing DC content. As such, a Snyderverse restoration, as we've defined it in the beginning of the video, is unlikely to happen. That doesn't mean the news is all bad, even for Snyder fans. Zaslav himself hasn't publicly spoken on the matter, nor has he at the time of making this video formally appointed a head of the DC film division, although Dan Lin is reported by the trades as being in talks. We probably won't have any official answers until a DC event that is planned for December, but we do have leaks from multiple sources in the know, so let's hear what they have to say. Zaslav has spoken about the next 10 years of DC storytelling and a reset to kick it off, but according to both our sources, Mikey Sutton's sources, and other leaks out there in the ether, this does not refer to another Batman-style hard reboot with an all-new cast and everything else. Instead, as we've been reporting for months already, it would appear that Zaslav is going to take a similar approach to what Hamada did before and what Johns and Berg did before that. Namely, to keep the cast and the continuity that Snyder established, but pick and choose what to keep and what to discard going forward, and present it all in a very different manner and tone than what came before. It stands to reason that while Zaslav, by all accounts, will take the same basic approach as Hamada, Johns, and Berg, his execution of that approach could be different from theirs, as theirs was from Snyder's. While DC movies made under Zaslav from the ground up won't be in theaters for years, the DC reset and beginning of his 10-year plan will be here before you know it. In the beginning of August, while Hollywood was still reeling over the cancellation of Batgirl, something which spelled the end for all of the previous Sarnoff's regime's plans, Zaslav assured everyone that the other movies in production will still be released, saying, "We have seen The Flash, Black Adam, and Shazam 2. We're very excited about them. We've seen them, we think they're terrific, and we think they could be made even better." That was code that all of them would be subjected to reshoots in order to fit the Zaslav regime's new 10-year plan. How extensive reshoots would be required, however, varied from project to project. By this time, we're already reporting that according to Tom's sources, the reshoots required on Shazam 2 and Aquaman 2, let alone The Flash, were extensive enough that all of them would end up being pushed back by months. Our reporting confirmed on August 24th when it was announced that both Shazam 2 and Aquaman 2 would indeed be pushed back, the latter until Christmas of next year, which means The Flash is unlikely to be released until 2024, although that has not yet been confirmed as of the making of this video. That would make sense though, as 2024 is also the absolute earliest that DC movies greenlit and made from the ground up under the Zaslav regime can be expected to be released. You'll note that Black Adam was not pushed back though, and we never heard it was going to be either. According to an even earlier report from Mikey Sutton's Geekosity magazine, Black Adam was filmed tonally similar to Man of Steel in the first place, so the reshoots required on it might not have been extensive enough to warrant a delay. What should be comforting to Snyder fans though is that around the same time that Zaslav implied that reshoots would be forthcoming, the world learned from Jason Momoa's Instagram that Ben Affleck was being added to Aquaman 2 in reshoots. A few weeks after that, Sil Abdul and Mikey Sutton reported that Henry Cavill had been added to Black Adam in reshoots, donning the cape again for the first time in years. This, however, is not something we have been able to verify with our sources. If it indeed is accurate though, it would be significant because on August 28th, the leaker Geralt of North added credence to all earlier reports that both ourselves and others tweeting, "Attention everyone, David Zaslav had set up a 10-year plan and the new storyline starts from Black Adam. Anyone who says it connects to the Snyderverse is lying for clicks. It will be a new storyline with most of the Snyderverse cast returning." Indeed, by all accounts, the Snyderverse, as we defined in the beginning of this video, will not be restored. However, the Snyder legacy will nonetheless live on by way of the cast and the continuity. Tonally and story-wise, we'll just have to wait and see what the Zaslav regime has in store for us. When we get an inkling though, you will hear about it first, so be sure to smash the like and hit subscribe so you'll never miss an update. With that, be sure to let us know your thoughts on this in the comments. And before you go, be sure to visit stuffforhire.com to find what you need or help others find what they need, all the while strengthening your local community.